Good evening. I'm Carolyn Ivanoff, and it's wonderful to be here at the German Club in Milwaukee this evening with the Civil War Roundtable in Milwaukee. They've invited me to speak about my book. The book is titled We Fought at Gettysburg. It focuses on the 17th Connecticut and many, many unpublished first-hand accounts of the Battle of Gettysburg. You can purchase the book at Amazon or various retailers. And I'm especially excited here tonight because I'm going to focus on many of the accounts of the aftermath of battle and what these men suffered, went through, and remembered. And I use some of their own words. So I think it's pretty special to listen to these voices tonight, and I thank you very much for inviting me.
I'll use the dad voice. Only long enough for one announcement that I did miss, and that all of you should have seen at your places this evening, a copy of the Smithsonian Magazine. Wanted to thank John Helmenstein for providing those for us.
Carolyn Ivanoff is a retired high school administrator and independent historian. She's worked in education for over 30 years and has experience both inside and outside the classroom and was named Civil War Trust Teacher of the Year in 2003. Though no longer in the classroom, she still does quite a bit of programming for local historical societies and state of Connecticut organizations. She continues to reenact and continues to be invited into high school classrooms. She writes and lectures frequently and is the author of We Fought at Gettysburg, first-hand accounts by the survivors of the 17th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry, which features first-hand accounts by the survivors of the 17th and their experiences on the battlefield. She's here tonight to tell us some of their stories and has brought copies of her book, which she will gladly sell and autograph for you after the presentation. Carol.
Well, thank you for having me tonight. Iron Brigade territory, which I'm thrilled to be at. When Dave Wegge was saying to me the German Club in Milwaukee, well, it didn't ring any bells for me, but then he said, well, it's the Mitchell Mansion. And something clicked, and I did double check and look it up, and there's a tremendous connection between this place and the Iron Brigade. And James F. Sullivan, the son of James P. Sullivan, who you all know, Sergeant Mickey Sullivan, he lived to be almost 100, and he was a veteran of Billy Mitchell's 2nd Bomb Group before the Second World War. So I thought that was a connection. I don't know what clicked for me there, but we're going to talk tonight about a lot of stories, history from the bottom up. Dave also gave me your Milwaukee, Wisconsin brochure. It says Civil War history speaks to us every day. It certainly does if you pay attention to the voices. And I don't mean that, the voices in your head. But, I always say the past speaks to us with many voices, and we're going to hear some of those voices tonight. And this program follows members of the 17th Connecticut through the 3-day Battle of Gettysburg and beyond. A great deal of the book is devoted to the aftermath. And, these guys are going to be in combat for 3 days, and they're going to live with this battle for the rest of their lives. So we're going to hear some of their words. We're going to follow them in this program. We're going to see what their experiences meant to them, and hopefully I can bring those experiences up to the 21st century, and we can see what it means to us, because their sacrifices gifted us in this nation with so much. War is the worst experience in the human condition, and yet it brings with it great social, technological, and medical advances. And so all honor to these men. This is the book. You can see it up there. It's I'm going to take 12 accounts from this book, or 12 guys from this book. And you have to realize these 12 guys are really emblematic of all the soldiers of the Army of the Potomac. When we talk about the 11th Corps and 12th Corps, they're going to enter the meat grinder and truly be sacrificed on that first day. Their experiences are often quite the same. This is history of people like us, written from the bottom up. These people have something to tell us. We have something to learn from them. I went to a program Kent Masterson Brown presented. You know, he wrote Me, Study in Command, got all kinds of awards. And he looks at history, the history of the Civil War in Gettysburg from the top down. But these guys, these little people like us, really have something to tell us. So what can we learn from them? You know, we know a lot about the battle. I know this is a very knowledgeable audience, but what light can these individual citizen soldiers shed on the most written about battle of the American Civil War? Well, I know from hearing them that they fought this battle hungry and thirsty. Many were impaired before they reached the field. Some of the toughest marching of the Civil War took place before the battle. When the battle began, there was no supplies. There was very little water. The guys had only what they were carrying in their sacks. They did have 60 rounds of ammunition, and that's what you need to fight a battle. That they had marched out of their shoes, and about half of the Army of the Potomac is barefoot at and through this battle is not something that's commonly recognized. But we know this because these men tell us. I also know this because Kent Masterson Brown, when he wrote Lee's Study in Command, went through the National Archives and all the quartermaster requisitions. And Kent Masterson Brown confirms what these men tell me. About half of the Army of the Potomac was without shoes. Now, something we don't really associate with the northern armies. You know, we always think that's a southern thing, but Rufus Dawes, here we go. Rufus Dawes, what is he going to tell us? He's going to say after the battle, our men have become ragged and shoeless by the thousands and have marched for days barefoot over flinty turnpikes. So not a condition that is contained to the 11th Corps alone, but these citizen soldiers become emblematic of them all. So what happens? Well, the battle starts to shape up. You know, we know both armies are searching for each other. You know, they're on that extensive Gettysburg road system that's going to bring the armies together in what they historians call an engagement meeting. But on June 28th, Lincoln fires Hooker and George Meade takes command. Now, commanding generals, Meade knows he's marching toward battle. He doesn't know where it's going to begin, doesn't intend to fight at Gettysburg. Commanding generals must prepare to win battles. So our artillery, ammunition, and infantry are immediately ordered to the front and given priority. There's going to be scant preparation for the wounded. Meade, in the face of battle, orders all of his corps commanders to send all wagons except ammunition and ambulances to the rear. So what does this mean? This means that there's going to be a little bit of a disaster here for any of the wounded. Battle. You're going to enter a battle, you're going to have a lot of wounded. Jonathan Letterman, Major Jonathan Letterman, medical director of the Army of the Potomac, is immediately alarmed. And he tries to salvage the situation, which is just an impending human disaster. He tries to create a reserve supply train. He really tries hard to mitigate what he knows is coming for these men who are going to be wounded. And the lack of all supplies except ammunition is going to create a horrendous situation. And Letterman tries to mitigate it, but when the battle begins, most medical supplies are 20 miles away in Westminster. So these guys enter the battlefield and they clash together, greatest battle of the Civil War, and there is a horrific situation for the casualties and for the medical personnel that are expected to treat them. But because Jonathan Letterman is in charge, and Jonathan Letterman, we all know, is going to be honored as the father of battlefield medicine, Letterman had instituted protocols, notably at Antietam, that are going to raise survival levels for this Army of the Potomac. He's going to do a lot of common sense things that have not been done before, but they are going to become protocols that at Gettysburg are going to be well in place. What does Letterman do? He creates a trained ambulance corps that answers only to the medical department and revolutionizes evacuation procedures. He institutes this 3-tiered triage system of evaluating and sorting the wounded into 3 categories. It's still used today in every mass disaster. What he does is he sorts, or he has his doctors sort the men into mortal wounds, slight wounds, and surgical cases. Mortal wounds, off to the side. Slight wounds, off to the side. Surgical cases, get to them as soon as possible. It is revolutionary then, and something we take as common sense today, and still use today. All of these reforms become known as the Letterman system, and during the Civil War, they are cutting-edge protocols and advances that save lives. And they tremendously improve the treatment and survival of the sick and the wounded, and Letterman, again, becomes regarded as the father of battlefield medicine. So what are the implications for 21st century? Because we're talking about what these men and what they say mean to us today. What are the implications for 21st century? Well, the Letterman system created during the Civil War, the procedures of triage, evacuation, emergency care, are still utilized today, worldwide, in mass casualty situations. So we have a gift here, a gift born of vast suffering and bequeathed to us that we still use today. I just will say one thing. In the Civil War, it was the golden 24 hours. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, golden hour. Today, we have the golden hour. They had the golden 24 hours that raised survival rates tremendously under Letterman. We have the golden hour, and that means, hey, listen, you have a stroke, you have a terrible accident in the street, if that emergency medicine services can reach you within an hour, your chances of survival are greatly increased. And so this begins during the Civil War. Now, I know many of you are familiar with this. I'm not going to belabor this. I'm going to have to, I might turn my head a little. I'll try to stay near the microphone. But this is a slide that shows the positions of the 17th Connecticut. 17th Connecticut is 11th Corps, 1st Division, 2nd Brigade. If you look at the 2 current pictures on either side of the slide, you're going to see Barlow's Knoll the first day. You're going to see the tablet there that marks their first battle position on the first day of battle, July 1st, 1863. That tablet marks the spot where the survivors said their beloved Captain Moore was shot in the head twice and died instantly. The flag, the tablet's raised in 1884, so it's relatively early. The flagpole next to it is raised by the veterans in 1885, 1 year later. The first pole is a wooden pole, and that marks the place where their beloved Colonel Fowler is decapitated horrifically in front of all of them by a shell. And none of these survivors who see this are ever going to forget it. And they are going to be, on that first day, in the midst of horrific hand-to-hand combat, and yet they're never going to forget the sight of their colonel dying. The second monument you see is the shaft that marks their position on East Cemetery Hill on July 2nd. They are going to be engaged in that horrific night fight where the Louisiana Tigers come at them in the dark, and they are going to hold the line. The three woodcuts you see in the middle there show what the battlefield looked like when the men were on it in these positions. Now, Gettysburg, they've tried to put back the view lines in many places. They've buried the telephone poles on the Emmitsburg Road. You can go to Gettysburg today, and I know many of you have. You can stand on these places and you can see exactly what the men saw in 1863. You cannot see what the 17th Connecticut saw in 1863 on either of their battle positions. And if you go there, you know what I'm talking about. You know, just the progress and the overgrowth, and both of those positions have really been obliterated with regard to the sight lines and what the men saw. So, we're also going to look at the hospital system. Now, you know, Gettysburg, there were about 400 homes in the town. 200 remain standing. There were 2,400 people, and the armies are going to leave behind about 2,400 wounded. Now, I hate numbers because numbers are a very slippery slope, and the numbers can't be fixed. I mean, we talk about horses killed. You can't get it to the nearest 1,000, okay? You're going to hear 4,000, 5,000, 7,000. Horrific numbers. With the men, you're going to have 24,000 wounded left behind in a town that has 2,400 approximately, a little less, men, women, and children. What do you do with all these men? 8,000 men are going to be killed instantly on the field. 4,000 to 5,000 are going to die very quickly after the battle. It's a mass of human wreckage. And so what to do with these men is going to be foremost. And so the hospital system is going to begin immediately. The first hospital for the 11th Corps is going to be the Almshouse Complex, or the poorhouse, the poor farm. And that is right in the path of the 11th Corps retreat, so that's going to be the first. Many of the wounded are going to make it through town if they can, and they're going to wind up on High Street in the German Reformed Church and the public school. They're both side by side still today on High Street. The Better Farm, which is across the street and has just been recently restored by the Park Service, beautifully done. That barn and that house are going to be overwhelmed. And then you're going to have the Spangler Farm. The Spangler Farm is going to be the hub of the 11th Corps system. So they're going to try to start, as soon as the Confederates evacuate Gettysburg, because you know Gettysburg is going to be controlled in a captured town. As soon as the Confederates evacuate on July 4th, they start moving these wounded out to Spangler Farm. So these hospitals are satellites, and everything's going to feed into the Spangler Farm, which you see in the center. And then, of course, as soon as the railroad bridges are repaired on the 7th of July, they're going to start shipping these guys out wounded by the hundreds and the thousands. They're going to start shipping them out in railroad cars to D.C. and Philly and York and Baltimore. They've got to get these people out of here. It's a massive disaster. I want to talk a little about the hospitals. A hospital is anywhere there is a source of water, some safety, and you know, every building, every barn, every house becomes a hospital. Just unimaginable. After the battle, the atmosphere of Gettysburg is absolutely overpowering with putrid air. It's polluted by dead horses and dead men and the vast amount of human waste and effluvia. You know, it's a world without electric, without hot water, without running water. It's a world lit only by fire. Where are the latrines? They are everywhere. You had 175,000 men engaged in battle. Where are the bathrooms? Everywhere. You have approximately, I'll say 5,000 dead horses, but one horse alone will emit 10 gallons of urine and about 12 pounds of manure daily. That's a lot of horseshit. So anyway, after the battle, the atmosphere of Gettysburg is absolutely overpowering. Dead men, dead horses, vast amount of human waste. Dead human and horse flesh begin rotting in the July heat. The torrential summer rains that come on July 4th, they begin on July 4th, uncover and expose shallow graves. The hospitals are charnel houses of amputated limbs and maggot-infested wounds. Flies, millions of them, blacken the landscape. The thick, sickening atmosphere is inescapable and intensely palpable. You would have smelled Gettysburg from miles away if you were a relief worker trying to get to the town to help. The smells of sweat, blood, urine, feces, gangrene, and rotting flesh of human and horses are going to clog the atmosphere and make it almost too difficult to breathe. Now, what's it like to go to a hospital as a relief worker? Hospitals are loud, they're unruly, they're disturbing areas of sensory overload. In addition to the inescapable odors and frightening sights, in their misery and distress, the wounded shout, they groan, they cry, they scream. And this goes on day and night. Everybody knows where the courthouse is on Middle Street, right? It's a hospital, a vast hospital. There is so much noise coming from the courthouse that after the Confederates leave and things get a little settled, a military band comes every single day and plays patriotic airs outside the hospital to try to drown out the sounds of the wounded screaming inside. So next time you go by that beautiful courthouse, think of what happened inside. Dr. Robert Hubbard, 17th Connecticut surgeon, is a 36-year-old surgeon from Bridgeport, Connecticut, and he's got a wife and a small child he leaves behind. Dr. Hubbard will treat his men right on the field. And he winds up running away a couple of times from the Confederates on the first day's battle. After being on Barlow's Knoll and nearly overrun, he winds up coming to the cemetery. That's why the cemetery gate is there. The beautiful evergreen cemetery is the center of the Union line. That fishhook line is the center of it. It is O.O. Howard's headquarters. Hancock is there on that hill. It is a vital place. Hubbard is also the medical inspector for the 11th Corps. He sets up a hospital right in the cemetery. Howard had ordered some of the taller stones laid down, but because he didn't want the Confederates using them as for artillery sightings, but still, stones are getting cracked and the artillery is landing in the middle. We don't know where the cemetery was. It's probably on the ground somewhere in a little, hollow and right out there. So that's where he's treating. After the battle, Hubbard is going to be left behind, and he's one of the surgeons at the 11th Corps Spangler Farm Hospital. One of his biggest jobs after the battle is to get these guys transported, get these guys into town, onto the railroad, into these cattle cars, and ship them out of Gettysburg. So let's talk about the medical situation for a second. When we talk about medical advances made in the Civil War, we talk about the Letterman system, which we did already, triage, evacuation. anesthesia. Almost every single surgery in the Civil War is performed under anesthesia. This is baloney about guys biting the bullet. Surgeons do advance onto the field and into battle with enough anesthesia to treat the wounded. So 95% of all surgical cases in the Civil War are under anesthesia. Either ether or chloroform. Obviously, the surgeons prefer chloroform because it's not as volatile as ether if you're operating by candlelight or lamplight, or there's incoming at you, you know? So that's the biggest myth of the Civil War, that guys were made to bite the bullet. One of the greatest American tragedy here, the greatest tragedy of the war, is that the war takes place before any understanding of germ theory. You have no idea. Everybody gets infected. Many of these guys are not strong enough to fight it off. Disease kills, out of 4 men, it's going to kill 3. Battlefield 1, the wounds will kill 1. So those are not good odds for germs. But these surgeons are excellent surgeons, made so by the war. Before the war, most doctors had never treated a gunshot wound. Can you imagine? Most doctors in the United States, North and South, had never, ever performed a surgery. Surgery was not used in America before the Civil War. But you know, we all know what makes a good surgeon: repetition and volume. So those guys that didn't treat a gunshot wound before the war, by the time the war ends, they treated quite a few. The other thing we need to know, in 1863, good Dr. Letterman has made some big reforms with regard to surgery. Only the best surgeons are operating. So this nonsense about Civil War surgeons being butchers is just that. If you're not a good surgeon by Gettysburg in 1863, then you are dressing wounds, you're doing hospital administration, you're treating illness, but you're not cutting into Letterman's boys. So only the best surgeons are operating. Now, what are they doing? They're doing a lot of amputations. Why are they doing amputations? Because amputations save lives. And these doctors know it. They have complex wounds that cannot be treated because of the mini ball. Mini ball is going to pulverize, shatter, destroy anything it hits. So, what's a good wound? Arm, leg, as far away from the trunk as you can get. What's the treatment? You take a wound that cannot be treated. You amputate, you make a simpler wound that can be treated medically and gives the patient the opportunity for success. Now, lest we say to ourselves, oh, well, modern medicine could take care of that. What's happening to our service people in the Mideast? What happened to the victims of the Boston Marathon pressure-treated bombs? Not even modern medicine could treat or can treat this type of wound. And so we're back again to doing amputations, which save lives. Again, the great tragedy is there's no germ theory. So, you know, that's a terrible situation and a story for another day. But what are the implications for us in the 21st century? Well, we know that before the Civil War, we didn't do hardly any surgery at all. It wasn't a practical treatment for Americans. After the Civil War, surgery becomes a life-saving measure and a treatment for Americans wherever and whenever Americans need surgical care in the United States. And we've only made gains since then. This is a quick little slide. This is Dr. Hubbard's Batman, for lack of a better, he watches the doctor's horse, he makes sure he stays with the doctor. They wind up escaping from Barlow's Knoll. The situation on Barlow's Knoll is that there's the 11th Corps forces up there are surrounded on 3 sides. They're outgunned horrifically, and they're outnumbered by about 3.5 to 1. So it's going to be a Confederate blitz up there. And these guys really try to stay there, but they do wind up retreating. Many become casualties. John Collins is holding the doctor's horse. He's with Hubbard. Hubbard is treating guys right on the field as they fall. And finally, all hell breaks loose, for lack of a better term. And the horses that John is holding rear up, and one of them falls on him. And he is very, very badly hurt. Dr. Hubbard comes running. He's escaping from the Confederates that are literally chasing him. He says, John, let's get on those horses. They jump on the horses. They do escape. They make their way somewhere in the vicinity of the cemetery where we talked about Dr. Hubbard trying to form a little field hospital or aid station. And John is trying to say to the doctor, I'm hurt. I'm hurt. Dr. Hubbard's like, I don't have time for this, John. Finally, Dr. Hubbard gets a good look at him and he goes, you got to go to the rear. When John Collins writes his story to William Warren, the guy that's collecting all these first-hand accounts, he never tells this story. I don't know. I always think, when you meet somebody and you tell them about yourself, or you have an experience you tell people, what do we tell people? What do we remember and what do we forget? John never tells this story. But I'm going through all the Connecticut papers, and I find in the Stamford Advocate that John wasn't only damaged when the horse fell on him, but he was shot in the chest. And his Catholic prayer book saved his life. So, the things that they carry, and this happens over and over again in the Civil War, where lead is flying at these guys. It's amazing anyone survives. It's going to happen to one other man that I know it was recorded with in the 17th Connecticut, a guy from our town in Connecticut. He's got a whole wad of writing paper wrapped up in his chest, and it stops the bullet, just barely, but it saves his life. And there's so much lead flying that he gets shot in the chest, he's saved by what he's carrying, and then he's subsequently shot in the leg. And the reason I know this is one of his friends writes that story from Spangler Farm, and we'll see that letter shortly. So there's no implications there for the 21st century, but it always is always astonishing to me for any of us. What do we remember? What do we forget? What do we tell people when we tell our story? So John didn't care to tell us that his Catholicness saved his life. This is Corporal Aaron Lee. He is going to make it off Barlow's Knoll. They're going to stand. They're going to try to form a battle line. That doesn't work. They form a second battle line at the almshouse. Just to give you a little geography, you know where that little cemetery is on Barlow's Knoll? That's the old almshouse cemetery. If you look from that cemetery over down the Harrisburg Road to the Ag Center, the Agricultural Center, that's approximately where the almshouse was. It came down in 1961, so it's no longer there. So Aaron Lee, he's fighting, he retreats, they form another battle line at the almshouse. That line collapses. He's starting to get away, and he's shot in the thigh just before he reaches town. And he writes to his father, I remained a prisoner at the almshouse until the 4th. Now you all know that Confederates, once they take the town, all of the wounded become wounded prisoners. And it's a hallmark of the Civil War that wounded from both sides immediately become non-combatants. Whoever is in charge of the field will treat them. Okay, so wounded from both sides, neither are ever denied care by the other side. So he remains at the almshouse prisoner until July 4th. From there, he's transferred to Spangler Farm. From there, they throw him on one of those cattle cars and they evacuate him to Philadelphia. He writes to his father, arriving on the night of the 9th, and then for the first time my wound was dressed, gangrene set in, and I had a pretty tough time of it. The doctors gave me up and said I could not live, but I did not agree with them. I had made up my mind that I was going to pull through, and I did. And after doing so, and I could walk with crutches, the doctors wanted to transfer me to the invalid corps, but I rebelled, and I got a furlough for 20 days, and through the kindness of Lieutenant Governor, Connecticut Governor Roger Averill, I was transferred to New Haven Night Soldiers Hospital, and by this transfer, the invalid corps was cheated out of a recruit, and I returned to my regiment at St. Augustine, Florida, arriving on the 6th of June, 1864, 11 months in various hospitals. And what is this invalid corps that Aaron Lee does not want to have anything to do with? Well, Uncle Sam needs everybody. And so if you become sick, if you're wounded, if they can rejuvenate you in some way, Uncle Sam is not letting you go. You're going to go into this so-called invalid corps and you're going to become a cook or a prison guard or a clerk, and you're going to release men, whole-bodied men, so that they can be available to fight. Now, what about this invalid corps? Well, first of all, everybody hated the name. Invalid, we don't say that anymore. Invalid, invalid. It meant to these 19th century men that needed their bodies to have a living. They were farmers, they were mechanics. They needed a whole body. They were not invalid human beings. They hated that name. IC, Invalid Corps. Well, that's Army shorthand for equipment that's inspected and condemned. IC. Who wants that? So the governor or the U.S. government says, well, we're going to rebrand it. We're going to make it more, more attractive to be a member of the Invalid Corps. We're going to call it the Veterans Reserve Brigade. Well, this does a little bit to make it better, but these men are not happy. However, they do very, very good work for Uncle Sam. They serve out their enlistments honorably and well, and they really contribute to the Union cause. When General Grant strips Washington, D.C. of its defenses during the Overland Campaign in 1864, strips Washington of all available personnel, leaves a skeleton crew there. And who comes calling at Washington's door? Good old Jubal Early in 1864. And the city knows it's in trouble. So they call out what they have left, and it's the Invalid Corps. And the commanding officer that's inspecting these disabled men is just looking at them, and he says to their officer, "My God, will these men stand?" And the officer looks at him and says, "Well, we can't run away." But they do excellent service. Now, why is this important to the 21st century? What are the implications for us? Despite these negative perceptions, again, the Veteran Reserve Corps does good work for the Union Army. And the Invalid Corps becomes one of the very first instances, very first attempts by the federal government to create an active role for the disabled. And it proves, for the most part, a success. And today, our society continues to grapple with these questions of how best to provide for the disabled, how to eliminate prejudice toward them. Our attitudes have changed considerably. We no longer consider the disabled invalid human beings, but we as a society continue to try to create a better world and opportunities for all of those who suffer from disability, both seen and unseen. So definitely a very progressive mark. This is J. Henry Blakeman. He's a 22-year-old farmer from Stratford. He and his messmates, there's 4 of them. Henry, his cousin Celia Blakeman, his best friend Stephen Crawford, and Sylvester Rounds. Now this is the odds on Barlow's Knoll. Typical. These guys are shoulder to shoulder in Company D. The Confederates are coming at them. They're told to fire. They lower their rifles. They get off a volley. And immediately, the Confederates get off a volley. Henry is shot through the side. He has a huge exit wound out his back, but luckily he's knocked out and knocked down. His friend who's right next to him, again, 4 guys shoulder to shoulder, Stephen Crawford, is shot through the head and instantly killed. Their other friend, Sylvester Rounds, is shot in the shoulder. Terrible. Only 1 of the 4 is left standing. These are the odds on Barlow's Knoll. You guys are all familiar with the Iron Brigade on the other side of the Chambersburg Pike. I mean, it's the same for them. These guys are being devastated. Henry is, he might even be considered a mortal wound, but amazingly, with this big hole blown in his side and his exit wound, this kid is able to walk once he wakes up. And the Confederates who are in control of the field direct him to walk to a hospital. Walks to that hospital, and on July 2nd, the Confederates throw a lot of these guys in wagons and start hauling them into town. And Henry is put into the public school, which you see there, it's still on High Street. Sightlines have changed tremendously in Gettysburg. But from the windows of their prison hospital, the 17th Connecticut is going to watch the night fight on July 2nd. And this is the accounts that Henry leaves. You can see his quote there. From the windows, they watched the attack. Here's another soldier on Barlow's Knoll. This is Justice Silliman. He's a 20-year-old school teacher from New Canaan. On Barlow's Knoll, he gets shot in the head. The bullet literally creases his skull. He's knocked out. He wakes up. The Confederates are all over the field. He's a prisoner. They send him to a Confederate field hospital. He, like Henry, the next morning is thrown into this old wagon, trucked into town. He winds up in the school as well. And he talks about his experiences. I want to say here that you have these wounded guys that are ambulatory, mobile. They immediately become the nurses, the caregivers of the more seriously wounded. And this man becomes a nurse to his fellow wounded prisoners. On day 3, he decides, the Confederates, the Confederate guards at the hospital say, any of you Yanks, you look out those windows, we're going to blow your head off. Don't let us catch you near the windows. So they know something big is cooking. And then that barrage starts, that Confederate barrage on July 3rd. So this kid, he's like, well, I want to know what's going on. He climbs up into the steeple of the school and he watches Pickett's charge. Now, I've done a little bit of research on this. How does this kid get away with this? Boy, I would like to be in that steeple. I find out all over Gettysburg that these wounded ambulatory prisoners, if they can get an eye view, they're going to do it. There's several Iron Brigade members that are at the seminary. And you know what they do? They go up into the cupola. And you know that great soldier poet, Mickey Sullivan, Sergeant Mickey Sullivan, ring a bell? Mickey Sullivan gets shot up pretty bad in the shoulder in the railroad cut. He's in the train station. He has a friend take him up to the steeple in the railroad station. So this is not an isolated event. So there's no 20th century, what does this mean for the 21st century, except people are pretty curious. And I'll tell you, if I could have climbed up somewhere and watched this battle, I think I might have tried. But I think that's pretty interesting because we just think of everybody hiding in cellars and everything. But these intrepid, wounded men want to be sure that they are going to see what's happening. Because the outcome is not assured. And they're really worried they're going to lose this battle. I just got another quote from Mickey Sullivan. He says that on the July 4th, he gets himself out into the street to see what's going on. Because the Confederates, he thinks, are retreating. And he says, and I'm going to paraphrase, he says, coming down the street is a squad of 11th Corps guys with 11th Corps flag. And he said, oh my God, I knew then that my people had won. So, these guys are all cognizant of this. This slide, this is an officer here. This is an officer, Captain French. He's on Barlow's Knoll. He's leading his company. He's got his sword in the air, and there's shrapnel everywhere. He gets clipped really bad in the elbow. And he leaves a very fascinating account. He's immediately captured by the Confederates. The doctor in the corner there, 17th Connecticut assistant surgeon, is going to treat him right in the field. French is really shook up. He writes in his memoirs, he can't remember how his sword got back in his sheath because he couldn't move. The doctor slits his coat, tries to bind him up so he doesn't bleed. He's immediately taken prisoner. Because he's a captain, he's got a private with him who kind of, helps the captain along. And he makes his way to the German Reformed Church. Now this map is here so you can see the sight lines at Gettysburg were nothing like they are today. And they start up at Barlow's Knoll, and French and his little private guy, they come down through the fields. They get onto Stratton Street, that escape route. They go right to the church, which you see there. The 17th Connecticut on the second day is going to be right below them. That's how they watch the second day's battle, and they have a bird's eye view. So anyway, French gets to the Lutheran church. The 11th Corps is the German Corps. The doctors treating the wounded at the German Reformed Church are all German. They're talking in German. One does examine French's wound. They speak to the captain, and he absolutely refuses the amputation. Usually a death sentence in the Civil War, but he's going to be lucky, I'll tell you that. His private soldier that's with him keeps the arm wet. He's getting a water dressing. Everybody at Gettysburg got a water dressing because they had nothing else with them. So he's transferred to Spangler Farm, and then here's how they treat wounded officers, okay? If you're mobile, and these guys are in really, really rough shape. If you're ambulatory and you're mobile, we're going to give them a 20-day leave. They give him a 20-day leave, they put him on a train, he winds up in Bridgeport, Connecticut, he gets off the train. I don't know how the heck he gets up to his house on Mill Hill Avenue. I know none of you know where that is, but I know where it is, and I'm like amazed. He's pounding on the door at night. It's July 8th, the night of the 8th. His wife probably does not even have a casualty list. He's banging on the door, banging on the door. Martha comes downstairs and she looks at him, and he's full of the mud and the blood from the battlefield. Never even cleaned up. She gets him in the house. This is how the Army does it. It's like, let the wife take care of him for the summer. Well, Martha must have done a good job because he did get well. But he writes after the battle that he had his boots on for 14 days prior to Gettysburg, never took them off. This is July 9th now, July 8th, July 9th. Well, Martha's got to get his clothes off. You know what she does? She has to cut his boots off. And French says, all of the skin from his legs and his feet and his toenails came off with the boots. So these guys, just to give you an idea of what kind of shape these guys are in, and not just the wounded, not just the wounded. This is the private soldier that is with Captain French. He enlisted at 16 years old. His name is Henry Wade. He enlisted at 16 years old in Bridgeport, Connecticut to escape in a drunken and abusive home life. His father was an abusive drunk. He joins the 17th Connecticut. Dr. Hubbard takes the kid under his wing, keeps him with him, makes him like a medical cadet. Maybe that's why he was assigned to Captain French. Henry is going to survive the war. He's going to muster out in 1865. And after the war, he's going to earn a medical degree. Now, Henry is a pretty clever kid. He becomes an inventor. He starts to invent all of these medical devices. He has a big company, becomes quite wealthy. He starts to experiment with electricity and medicine. Then his son, he lives to have a son, his son joins his father in the practice, and father and son start experimenting with fluoroscopes and x-rays. And it is Henry Wade's son who will invent the portable x-ray equipment that the AEF, the American Expeditionary Force, takes to Europe in World War I. So no longer is a surgeon forced to see inside the body, to probe inside the body with a finger or a metal rod. Now, you can take an x-ray. Those are actual x-rays. This is beyond belief for a Civil War surgeon. And you know what? We can't ignore the massive cost of life that damaged this nation because these boys sacrificed their lives. Henry's lucky. He has a son. He has a son. He contributes to society. And you know what? We benefit from these advances made today in the 21st century. Henry, when he first went into business and was inventing all these medical devices, we would probably consider it quack medicine. But he's applying electricity to medicine. What does that mean for us? Well, not only the x-ray part of it, but there is no diagnostic medicine available to us with our medical miracles in the 21st century without the application of electricity. So baby steps that we benefit from today. And this is another casualty of July 1st. He's going to be shot in the leg on Barlow's Knoll. He's going to have an amputation because they can't treat a compound fracture. And he is going to die on July 17th. So he lives, almost a week and a half, 2 weeks after the battle. Well, Americans want their dead to come home. We don't want to leave our boys on the battlefield. And during the Civil War, it was very, very difficult to recover bodies, and yet they did. He has an uncle who takes this, it's recorded in the book, he copies every expense, he writes down every step of this journey. He gets caught in the draft riots in New York. It is an amazing thing what these people do, these Americans do, to bring their loved ones home. The journey is arduous, difficult, costly, and you have to be awfully strong. And so the Reverend that you see up there will go to Spangler Farm. By the way, a little bit of trivia, the 26th Wisconsin 11th Corps Regiment is going to have the most wounded at Spangler Farm. What a hard fight they had. So Uncle goes to Spangler Farm. He has his son disinterred. The graveyard is in that field in the lower right that you see there, as his son disinterred. Now, as a result of the Civil War, there's going to be some changes in how Americans treat their dead. Yes, we want our dead to come home. We want our dead to be with us, among our loved ones. But the Civil War is going to begin to change forever how we treat death in America. One of the results is embalming becomes very prevalent. Now, embalming was not unknown before the war, but you're not going to be able to transport an unembalmed body. And in fact, there's all kinds of laws against this. You know, the bodies would have to be freighted home. They would go with the freight. So, you know, loved ones would ride with the passengers. Their beloved dead would be behind them in the freight cars. There were a lot of embalming surgeons at Gettysburg, and embalming would become prevalent in America because it was a necessity to embalm corpses before transporting them back home by freight. Unembalmed or poorly prepared corpses become a transportation nightmare on trains. And only embalmed bodies were allowed to be shipped. After a while, you know, you have to learn by experience, right? So there's some horrific stories about this. And, you know, people who can afford it gladly pay for these services, which are pretty expensive. Besides allowing remains to be transported by rail, embalming also served the purpose of allowing loved ones to see for themselves the remains of their beloved dead. Because obviously, nobody wanted the wrong corpse. So implications for us, you know, in the 21st century is that during the 19th century, you know, death was something that was tended to at home by family members. Everything took place in the home. The preparation of the body, laying the person out, carrying the person to the cemetery was all within the family. It's a very personal task. The Civil War will change that, and it will create a whole revolution in funerary, embalming, and burial practices. You know, we hardly ever tend to death at home any longer, and this is a result of the war. How do we treat wounds? How do we treat those wounds to the chest? Well, triage in the Civil War says that if anybody is hit anywhere in the trunk, that is automatically considered a mortal wound, and you just put them off to the side. If you have something to make them comfortable, if you have some whiskey or you have something for pain, you put the person off to the side and you let them die. You're not going to expend any resources on them. And this is a very sad story. This young kid, he's going to be shot on the second day. His lieutenant and the squad is going to put him in a rubber blanket, carry him up East Cemetery Hill to the hospital that's somewhere behind the cemetery gate. He has what Civil War surgeons refer to as a sucking wound, considered mortal. And there is a doctor on the field, Dr. Benjamin Howard, who has explicit permission from Jonathan Letterman, Major Jonathan Letterman, to pick out such surgical cases as he finds and do an experimental surgery on him. Howard will operate on about 10 men. and Alva Wilcox is one of them. If I look in the medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion, I can find this case. He is operated on in the field, which I think means right out in the open air in the cemetery. So what is Howard's experimental surgery? You have a lung that won't hold air. He's going to, what he calls, hermetically seal it. So he says, well, if a lung is open and won't hold air, I think I can seal that lung. He uses metal wire, metal sutures. He binds the lung and then he seals it with collodion so that what he thinks it's going to be able to hold air that gives the patient the chance to survive. He's on the right track. However, there's no germ theory. So every single one of these cases goes septic, and they all die. And so the judgment is that don't bother with this because it has no effect, this surgery has no effect on the rate of mortality. But you know what? Implications for the 21st century? He is on the right track. And it will lead, this experimental procedure for hermetically sealing lungs is going to lead to a standard practice for successful treatment. So all of this goes on and on. And, you know, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. It is not unusual. If you die on the Gettysburg battlefield, you're going to have not one burial, but at least two. And many of these guys are going to be buried 3 times. This is a gentleman that's going to be buried 3 times. Look, Alva, his brother wants his brother to come home. His brother Charles makes a horrific trip down from Connecticut. Wants his brother to come home. He gets his brother disinterred from the Spangler Farm burial ground. He gets his brother the required coffin. He gets his brother embalmed appropriately. And while all of this is going on, his brother's being embalmed, etc., the provost marshal says no more bodies transferred from Gettysburg. The place is, you know, a disease-ridden pit. No more bodies get disinterred. Well, he's got his brother. What am I going to do with? I want my brother to come home. No, can't bring him home. He goes to the Evergreen Cemetery, pulls a burial permit, and he buries Alva in this cemetery. Who buries Alva? Elizabeth Thorne buries Alva. The cemetery gatekeeper is off to war with the Pennsylvania Regiment. He leaves behind his pregnant wife. She's 6 months pregnant. She's got 3 little boys. She's got 2 elderly parents. Her usual burial number is about 4 or 5 a month. Well, she winds up wearing the same dress for 6 weeks, 6 months pregnant, in that terrible, terrible heat, under terrible conditions. She buries approximately 105 soldiers on the side of the hill facing the Baltimore Pike. And they're still there, but not Alva, because Charles is bound to determine that his brother is coming home to Connecticut. So as soon as winter strikes in January, he gets on a train, goes to Evergreen Cemetery. Elizabeth has to disinter Alva again, and Alva is brought home to Connecticut. So he's one of those that's going to be buried 3 times. And his stone, the government apparently does not know that Alva is no longer there, and you can see his stone there. But you know, we are not so very different from our ancestors. We want our boys to come home. It's an American thing. Now, this is Henry Blakeman again. We'll talk about him just briefly. That is his best friend, Stephen Crawford, the young man that's hit in the head. I want to briefly talk about this. He writes, Henry is going to write a letter, a remarkable letter to his mother on July 4th in the pouring rain from Stanton Farm. It's one of the most remarkable letters I've ever read. And he writes to his mother, Stephen is dead. What I tell you, you can trust. I know it's going to almost kill his mother, but tell her her son is not coming home. You know, during the American Civil War, that the Army never notified families if a soldier died. There was no central graves registration. There were no formal dog tag procedures. Therefore, estimates range as high as 40% of all the Civil War dead are unknown. It's a terrible situation. Well, he writes this remarkable letter home to Mom, and he says, what I tell you, you can trust. Stephen is not coming home. He also tells his mom that this piece of paper he got from Stiles Wells, and this is part of the wad of paper that saved Stiles Wells' life. So that's one of the papers. And he writes to her a sentiment that's very, very common in Civil War letters, especially if somebody survived the battlefield. P.S. Tell them I was shot, face toward the enemy. No Reb saw my back. Well, Henry is going to be transported by rail to Jarvis Hospital on July 9th. He writes his sister on July 17th. Dear sister, last Monday we were brought here. Before we came here, we saw pretty hard times. Lying on the ground with only a shelter tent for 5 days, I was wet through and had not half enough to eat. I wore the same shirt that I was wounded in, all bloody, for 9 days and a half. And that time it was full of maggots, and I wore the same pants till I got here. The Reds blanked me, but I guess I shall be good for another dig at that yak, Henry. So Henry's the boy with the hole blown in his side. And my thoughts are that that maggot-ridden shirt and that maggot-ridden wound, those maggots probably saved his life. Because maggots, we know, are nature's surgeons, and they probably clean that wound. He's still going to take 11 months to recover. 11 months in different hospitals. And, you know, what are the implications for us today? Well, you know what? Henry lives. He survives. He comes home to contribute to his community. He holds every office in the city of Stratford. He becomes a Connecticut legislator. The piece of legislation he's most proud of is that he closed the saloons on Memorial Day. He is just a grand old man. And he's there in 1917 leading the Memorial Day parade. He's up there in front, and what a guy. But you know what? The death rates in the Civil War rocked our nation, they rocked our communities, and it took years for this nation to recover. Now, we talked about nurses. Who were nurses? Most nurses were enlisted men that were ordered to nurse, or they were ill soldiers or wounded soldiers themselves that tried to help more wounded soldiers. This is George Dickens. He's going to prove to be one of the best nurses. He's never wounded, but he and his friend John, before they hit the battlefield on July 1st, they make a pact. If you're wounded, I'll stay with you, and if I'm wounded, you must stay with me. So they make a pact. Well, John, I like to call him John Travolta because that's who he looks like to me. But John is really badly wounded, and George immediately gets him off the field, gets him to the German Reformed Church. George himself is going to pretend to be wounded. I think the Confederates are onto him because the Confederate patrols are sweeping into these hospitals, taking away anybody they think is, trying to play wounded. I think they're onto him. Some Confederate says to him, drop your traps, drop your equipment, put a white rag around your arm, we'll leave you alone. So he stays. He not only stays here at the German church, he stays at Spangler Farm. He stays behind when the armies leave, and he proves to be quite a good man for what he does for his fellow soldiers. Now, this is James Middlebrook, another nurse. He's assigned to nurse, and he was excused from combat after the first day. He's a flag bearer, fights hard the first day. Major Brady knows him quite well and says to him, you got to get off the field. Go to Spangler Farm. They didn't know what was Spangler Farm, but go behind the lines, go to the hospital, help nurse our wounded. This young man, James Middlebrook, has what is considered quite serious in the Civil War, and is oftentimes a serious rupture is an excuse for immediate resignation. You know, they just send you home. He is ruptured so very badly, he can hardly move. So he's got a hernia. That's really bad. So Major Brady says to him, you go to the hospital, stay there, help the wounded, and he does. And he writes a letter to his wife, dear wife, there are a number of ladies here every day, one who belongs to some regiment and wears a soldier's uniform throughout, and one lady was here with the American costume, a pair of bloomers today. So he writes this home to his wife. So it's like July 9th, and women are coming in as volunteers to try to help the wounded. And who are these two women he writes about? Well, I think one is Mary Teppy, 116th Pennsylvania. You know Mary Teppy, she's going to earn the Carney Cross. She's the next farm down at the next farm over from Spangler, and she's nursing the 5th Corps wounded. We know for sure she's on the field. She wears the Zouave uniform of her regiment, so I think there's a great possibility it's her. Who's the other one? I think there's a great possibility it might be Mary Walker, Dr. Mary Walker, who is going to be the only woman awarded the Medal of Honor. So I think that's, after a lot of research, I think those are two very good guesses with a lot of educated research for who this man is writing home to his wife about. So what about nurses? Before the Civil War, nursing took place at home. The doctor came to your house on a house call, and your mother nursed you, your wife nursed you, grandma or an aunt. Everything took place in the home. For a woman to leave her home and nurse strange people, never mind strange men, that was shocking. Nobody wanted to be a nurse. There was no such thing as a nurse before the Civil War. If you got arrested for prostitution in New York City, you had 3 choices. You could pay the fine. Nobody had money. You could do the time, which almost all of them did, or you could choose to work off your sentence by nursing at Bellevue Hospital. Nobody would. But the Civil War is going to change forever women's roles in medicine. And for the first time, women come out of their homes, they volunteer. These patriotic women do so much good, even though in many cases they are not wanted. They are abused. But everywhere women go in the Civil War, survival rates increase. Because what do women do? They clean, they wash the men, they cook good food, they wash clothes. Cleanliness is next to godliness and also survival. The veterans will never forget what these women do. And after the war, in 1872, the very first trained nursing program begins at Bellevue Hospital. So if you've ever ever had the services of a trained female nurse, the roots of that, the implications for us, begin in the 21st, in the Civil War. And that affects us directly today. And this is my last slide, but I do want to talk about this. Anybody ever heard the expression, it's going to take an act of Congress? That, right? My mother used to say it to me all the time, señorita, it's going to take an act of Congress, because I used to want to do all these impossible things, right? Well, this expression, that it will take an act of Congress, may refer to the congressional bills necessary for the passage of veterans' pensions in the Committee of Military Affairs. You couldn't get a pension without an act of Congress. So, on August 31st, Bridget Roach, whose husband James Roach, 17th Connecticut Company E, dies on January 6, 1865, in the Regimental Hospital at St. Augustine. This widow is an Irish immigrant. She's got a little son. She applies for a pension. I can't find anything anywhere on this woman. All of a sudden, I find this congressional bill in the congressional record. 26 years later, on June 16, 1886, Bill H.R. 228, titled For the Relief of James Roach, is introduced into the first session of the 49th Congress. And the bill states, the grounds upon which the claim for relief are based are as follows. That said Roach at the time of his alleged desertion was insane and not responsible for his acts, and then he continued to be insane until his death on January 6th of inflammation of the brain. So what does this mean? Well, like any good congressional bill, you need testimony. And so they go and they interview the regimental surgeon. They interview this man's corporal. They interview this man's sergeant. They all give testimony to the effect that it was probably combat that drove this high-strung man insane. His corporal will state that just before Chancellorsville and after, Roach began exhibiting mental derangement, and the corporal testified that his actions at times were not those of a man of sound mind. And during the campaign through Virginia, and previous to the Battle of Gettysburg, the corporal believed that Roach was of unsound mind. But after Gettysburg, and for the rest of his service, Corporal Perry is quoted that his insanity and death were caused by the necessities of his service. What are the implications for us in the 21st century? Well, we'll never know the true sacrifices and costs of war. We won't ever know what the effects are to those who do not manifest physical wounds. And this unseen costs of war took a tremendous toll on men in the Civil War as they do in every war. The war's horrible effects on the mind as well as the body, the effects of post-traumatic stress, the distress of alcohol and addiction in coping with wounds, both seen and unseen, and all the hidden costs of war are still not well understood by us in the 21st century. War is not kind to the human psyche. Wounds that are unseen can be as deep and as terrible as those that are visible. And James Roach's Find Grave lists him as lost at war. And so he was with so many others. And so that's an overview of 12 stories from men from my book. There's a significant amount of combat in the book, but there are also stories of the aftermath. And I hope with this program that I've done a little part in demonstrating that the service and sacrifice of the Civil War generation is still relevant and meaningful to us and our generation today. And again, may we as Americans always remember and honor and preserve our history. And I thank you so very much for having me this evening. I have no idea how long I spoke because it's different every time I do this. But if you have any questions, and I'll try to answer. And I do have books for sale if you're interested.
Questions?
Can you give a little more direction when the Union were in the hospitals on that first day,
Yep.
the second day, and the Confederates came through? Are they separating shirkers and non-wounded? Were they just kind of rushing through, looking for guys?
Yeah.
What was going on?
What's going on is the wounded are being treated by both sides. Many of these men in 17 Connecticut, because the Confederates overrun the field, they're being treated by Confederate surgeons and, Confederate guys that are assigned to treat the wounded. And they're being treated very humanely. But to your answer, once the Confederates take the town, they are sending squads in to search for Union that may be hiding, that may be pretending to be wounded, and they are rounding them up, and they are taking them prisoners, and they are marching them off.
Other questions?
I forget the surgeon that was there, and he had the private with them, and they go back.
Yep.
Where do they figure they're going? I mean, there is disunion all over, it's chaos.
Yep.
How do you figure out if you have a whole unit, you move with the unit? If you separate from your unit, where the hell do you go?
Well, you're right, it's chaos. And they're being pushed toward the town. And so where do these guys go? They go toward town. And they're being pursued. And they're being pursued through the streets, and they're being pursued through the backyards. Some of them are getting through. There are some companies, like 4 companies of the 17th, that are retreating in good order, and they are holding the Confederates back through the town as, there's total chaos around them. If you're familiar with the Coster Avenue, they're trying to contain the Confederates just so the fleeing Union guys, 1st Corps and 11th Corps, can get through the town, move past the town, and reassemble on East Cemetery Hill. So you're right. I think I have a quote from Rufus Dawes here. He's told, somehow he gets the message, reform Cemetery Hill, and he doesn't know where Cemetery Hill is. So they're just being pushed by massive Confederate forces. They're being pushed, and that pressure is funneling them toward the town. If they're lucky enough to get through town, they're going to form again on the other side of town, beginning at East Cemetery Hill. So it's total chaos, total and absolute chaos.
So you said as the Confederates take the town, they take prisoners. So it sounds like they took quite a few prisoners. Now, as we know, Confederates lose the battle and they retreat. How many of these prisoners did they take back, or did they leave the majority of the prisoners behind?
No, they did take quite a few of them. It's a very complex situation. The Confederates are the winners the first day, and they're technically the winners the second day, and it's not till the third day. So the prisoners that they take the first and second day are immediately, and a lot of this is in the book, because a lot of these guys become prisoners. They're pushed back behind Confederate lines. They're corralled behind Confederate lines. And when the Confederate forces begin to retreat, they're forced to follow. And it is horrific. These guys are, remember, some of them are barefoot, they're hungry, they're sunstruck, conditions are brutal. And these thousands upon thousands of prisoners are going to be following the Confederate Army. They're going to be contained in that big long column through the South Mountains. They're going to walk through the Cumberland Valley. They're going to start walking down the Shenandoah Valley, and they're going to be marched, and it's going to take many days. These guys by foot are going to be marched to the railheads in Staunton, Virginia, and then they're going to be loaded onto cattle cars, open cars, not really box cars, and they're going to be railroaded to prisons in Richmond, Belle Isle for the non-coms and the privates, and Libby Prison for the officers. It is a horrific, but officers and men are walking together until they're separated. So it's just a horrific situation.
Okay, Carolyn, thank you for your presentation. I want to present you with our Certificate of Honor by order of the General Staff of the Civil War Roundtable of Milwaukee. This award is presented to Carolyn Ivanoff for furthering our understanding of the causes and consequences of the American Civil War, the watershed event in our nation's history.
No, you're not done. You mentioned Jimmy Sullivan. He, along with Bill Upham, son of Willie Upham II, gave the Civil War Roundtable of Milwaukee custodianship of the Iron Brigade Association, originally formed after the war by the veterans of the Iron Brigade. It is my privilege to present signifying membership in the association to you.
Thank you.
Carolyn.